So thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Concha, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. So, we're clearly at a time of thresholds, I think. There are many different thresholds. On the one hand, there are multiple crises. And on the other hand, there are multiple extraordinary initiatives that are bringing us into the possibility of a new future. And I want to focus on one thing in my talk, because I believe it's a crucial part of moving into a new future, really crucial part, and that is consciousness. I want to talk exclusively in my talk about inner development, because I believe without that, however well-intentioned we may be, and however much we may want something different, we very easily hijack the whole process and simply repeat either mental patterns from the past or more likely unhealed emotional patterns, unless we attend to those in the right way. And I was just coaching an activist actually earlier in the week who does amazing work, and he had a moment of revelation when he realized that there was a whole part of his motivation that was coming from an unhealed wound in himself. And he went into deep grief, and he really allowed himself to feel that wound and understood that the quality of his work will now be different. He may continue doing the same thing, but with a very different consciousness. So I, as Jacob said, I work, the last 12 years I work in, with CEOs, boards, senior teams worldwide. I teach in business schools. I just had this week I taught a 2-day program on presence at the IMD in Lausanne with 33 leaders from virtually every corner of the globe. And it's a really interesting journey. It's a really interesting journey. We actually had a remarkable 2 days. And it's an interesting journey because the leaders I work with, there are certain patterns, and I'm going to generalize a bit because we don't have so much time. One of the things that's very helpful that I'm continually hearing is that the way we've been working is only one part of what can take us forward. This is very helpful, even though it's arriving through crisis, but that's often how change happens. What I mean by that is that more and more leaders are understanding that their way of thinking and their way of operating simply can't cope with the growing complexity and volatility and unpredictability of the world. And this is very helpful for me anyway. It gives me an easier access. And one of the simple metaphors I like to use is that that old way of working is like a narrow bandwidth, if we use computer analogy. It's a narrow bandwidth. And it becomes consuming, it becomes addictive, and it blinds people initially to the fact that our possibility as human beings is to have this bandwidth. Actually, it goes wider than I can indicate. But a lot of the leaders and organizations I work with, through no fault of their own, are in this narrow bandwidth, and they know it, but they're not quite sure how to move out of it. And that's really the work we do, and it's quite an amazing journey. And I'm going to read you something at the end that one person wrote this week at the IMD. So,
excuse me, IMD means what?
It's the Institute of Management Development. It's considered Europe's #1 business school. And it's the most conventional business school. So it's very interesting to go in there and try to bring in new consciousness. It's really very conventional. So we do a lot of experiential work. Maybe we'll have time just to do one little exercise. But I also, of course, use some models, some fairly simple models. One of the things, by the way, that's very interesting, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is this current explosion of interest in mindfulness. I guess you're aware of it. Some of you anyway. I mean, it's unbelievable how quickly and how fast this is becoming a currency in the business world, in the health sector, and in education. There are many articles now about how many organizations have meditation rooms. Intel earlier in the year announced mindfulness program for 100,000 of their employees. This is extraordinary. And I think this is a very encouraging sign of people realizing that we need a bigger bandwidth. Because mindfulness, at the very least, is a gateway to a bigger bandwidth. Even, I mean, last night at Heathrow, I was in the bookshop, and I bought a book called Mindfulness for Dummies. It's even reached the popular airport bookstore. I thought this was fascinating. I meant to bring it, I left it in the hotel. It's good, it's very good, it's very good. It presents it in a very accessible way. So I'm going to just go through a couple of the key models I use, because I think I hope they have quite a lot to say to us. So the first one is really quite simple. And it's based on a very simple polarity, because everything is polarity or duality. And this says that as human beings, we are capable of two modes: doing and being. Here we can write almost anything, but let's just say high performance, leadership, whatever we want to say, but this is the integration of being and doing. So if we talk about some of the characteristics of each of these, there's a huge literature, obviously, that this would tend to be more left brain, this would tend to be more right brain. But then if we get to something more practical, this side of us is extremely proactive. This side is more receptive. So this side of us, and this is obviously very, very relevant in the business world, this side of us is constantly looking for the next solution, the next action. What do I need to do? What do I need to fix? It's very driving in that way. It's obviously very important, but not when it's at the expense of being receptive. And the more senior people become in leadership, the more important it is that they learn how to not get lost in the detail, but be able to hold a bigger picture. And the only way to hold a bigger picture is to consciously cultivate the capacity to be receptive. And this is I talk a lot with leaders about what's your practice, what's your discipline. And what's your discipline around creating every week a significant amount of reflective, receptive time. Whether you do that through exercise, whether you meditate, whether you go for walks, whatever it is. How do you open on a regular basis that more receptive emptiness? We know that we often hear the phrase from artists, scientists, entrepreneurs, the idea came to me. The idea came to me. Well, the idea can't come to us if we're constantly doing it. It's just not possible. We have to learn how to be receptive. The great American poet William Stafford had a beautiful phrase. He said, sometimes the truth depends upon a walk around a lake. So literally or metaphorically, how do we take those walks around the lake? It's a crucial part of leadership. Otherwise, we are simply lost. We're consumed and we're lost. This side of us takes information in a very rational way. This side of us gathers information in an intuitive way. These are two very different, equally important capacities, but they're very different. Einstein said something remarkable about this. Einstein, the great scientist, he said, the rational mind is a faithful servant. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift. And we have created a society which honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. It's an amazing statement. And I think that's more true than ever. Now, our whole education system is pushing us, except initiatives like Stefan's, is pushing us more and more into this left brain, measurable, target-driven mentality. Also, I hear senior leaders say a lot of the time, they often say, we knew what to do, but we had to wait 6 months for the numbers. That's ridiculous. If you know what to do, you have to have a bit of both. You have to have a bit of both. A study 2 years ago of how CEOs made their most important decisions, 100 CEOs were asked, 90% of them said, we analyze all the data, and then we go on our gut instinct. That's a great mixture of the two. This is trainable. We've forgotten, but this is trainable. It just takes the right kind of practice, and this becomes more and more open. And it's an extraordinary capacity of human consciousness. This side of us analyzes the world, which again is an incredible ability. This side of us has a more empathic and sensory relationship to the world. And this actually is very interesting and important. I'm going to talk more about this later, but because there's so much research now into right and left brain, I read about a recent experiment where they had a man in the hospital and they were researching, so they switched off his right brain, which you can quite easily do now with electrodes. So he was in pure left brain function. And he looked at his hand and he said, whose hand is this? Whose arm is that? Meaning that he did not feel embodied. This is very interesting. And one of the core practices, interestingly, of mindfulness is to reconnect to the body, because this immediately starts to widen our bandwidth, our consciousness. There were one or two others, but I'll just stick to... This is a very big one, and I'll say more about it later. This side of us relates to form, and this side relates to space. This is really key. This is so key. I'm going to talk about this again in the later part of my talk. Because in the world in which I work now all the time, there's a general agreement that that world has become fixated here. It's become fixated on these capacities, on the doing side. And people recognize that, as I said, this is no longer enough. We can't deal with the world anymore. But it's very difficult to open this. And one of the tyrannies of this side of us, of course, is that it can dismiss this. When someone is really completely identified here, one of their first reactions of all of this will be to try and dismiss it. But it's also useful to remember a wonderful quote Einstein had on his office wall, which said, "What counts cannot always be counted, and what can be counted doesn't always count." In more ancient philosophy, and maybe Silla will also talk about this, this is known as more yang, and this is known as more yin energy. So the basic proposition here is that to develop the kind of consciousness that can take us into a new tomorrow, we have to practice diligently a real integration of these. And this is a genuine developmental ladder. We can have state experiences where we suddenly experience this really opening, or even an integration of the two, but we need a developmental path that is stage development, that takes us gradually towards a higher and higher integration. Because actually when we're in peak performance, and as Jacob said, I many years studied what in sports they call the zone. I guess maybe you're familiar with that expression. It's the, he's shocked. It's the expression athletes use, or sports people, when they go into a very special state. And I observed this many times in the rehearsal room with actors. An actor, something would open in them, and it was a whole mind, body, heart opening, and it was visible in their physiology even. And once that had opened, the whole room changed. And if a group of actors would do that, you would be in the presence of something extraordinary. In a bare room, the room would be filled with emotion, it would be filled with imagery, it would just be filled with many subtle dimensions coming through these human beings. And I became very interested in studying that, because everyone knows that. Everyone here, we all have moments of that. In psychology it's called flow. Everyone in this room has moments. But I became very interested in what would be the practice of that. What's the real multi-level practice of that? And I researched a lot, and we got quite good at it in my theatre company. The actors learned how to regularly open at least the important stages of that, because there's one level of it that we could call pure grace, that you can't control, but you can certainly move your base camp significantly higher. So, practice is very, very important part of this, and that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit more now. So this is quite a simple map. Sometimes we'll spend a whole morning with this because it really seems to resonate with people, because it's quite simple, and yet it gives this clarity that we're over-fixated here, particularly in the leadership world, particularly in the organizational world. And once we really agree about that, then we can start to do exercises that begin to balance the two. So the other map I use, which is a much bigger map in a way, and holds a much bigger level of process, is this. I hope you can all see this. Can you see this at the back? Well enough? Yeah? Good. So this is a very ancient map. It's been around at least 2,500 years. It's a map that says we, and indeed the world, but here we're talking about we, are composed of 5 elements. So when I talk about presence, one of the definitions of presence would be how present am I to all parts of myself? Because the more present I am to all parts of myself, the more presence I will have and transmit. And in leadership, that's hugely important. So this, if you like, is a map of all parts of myself. So we have earth, water, air, fire, ether. We have the physical self, we have the emotional self, we have the mental self, we have the inspired or purposeful self, and then we have the higher dimensions of our consciousness, for which it's difficult to find a name. You could call that a deep self, a higher self, but I think it's interesting to call it no self. Because if you read the accounts that sports people give of their peak moments of being in the zone, it's really interesting how they describe it. So for instance, I was in the US recently, so I have US examples in my mind. If you think about the American quarterback, yeah, you've all seen a bit of American football, slightly weird sport for we Europeans. But in American football, they're all crouched down and the quarterback receives the ball, right? And he has about 2 or 3 seconds before 3 monsters are going to crunch him. Their only purpose is to smash this guy. He has like 2 or 3 seconds to do something. So if you read how those guys describe being in the zone, this is what they say. They say, first of all, time slowed down. And there was a kind of immense peace in me. And I felt I had all the time in the world. They also say, I knew where every single player was. And I knew their trajectories. And I knew exactly how to throw the ball 100 meters or however far they threw it. So they're in a very high state of consciousness in that moment. And their so-called normal self has significantly expanded in that moment. They're on a different game board. And interestingly, of course, they're on the kind of game board that mystical traditions have talked about for several thousand years. They probably don't think about it in those terms, but that's very, very similar. So let's talk a little bit about each of these elements, because I think they carry some important keys for what this new consciousness is that I believe is an essential part of creating a new tomorrow. So a fundamental part of this is the earth element, our physical body. Because I think here we already see a huge dysfunction, if you like, in what's happening at the moment in our collective consciousness. And the dysfunction is that we have become very, very disembodied. It doesn't matter that we exercise. I mean, it's better to exercise than not exercise. But most people, if you look at how they exercise, if you go to a gym, they're doing stuff to their body. And they are, in that way, reinforcing this fundamental split. Because when we were children, every single one of us in this room, when we were children, we experienced the world in our early life in a totally physical way. Moment to moment, life was a physical experience. And a very intense one. And it's normal in our development that we have to close that down for different reasons. We get messages that it's too much, sometimes we suffer big shocks, and we have to stop ourselves feeling. But in one way or another, we close down those channels. And we do that, interestingly, in 2 very simple ways, which we still do now as adults. One way is that we stop our breathing, which is what we still do now when we start to feel something we don't want to feel. And secondly, we tense our body. Those are 2 very primary mechanisms we all learned as we grew up. The consequence of that is a desensitized body, a more or less numb body. and experience of the body as an object that we take to the garage to be fixed when it goes wrong, rather than an open sensory channel. And this is a huge loss on many, many levels. And if you all think for a moment about what are the moments in your experience, even if they're few and far between, what are the moments when you really come home to your body? Just think for a moment what those moments are like. Could be massage, could be walking in nature, could be sport, could be physical contact with a loved one. How does it feel when even momentarily this whole extraordinary part of us that we call the body opens, and suddenly we're in our body in a different way? Suddenly we literally can feel the ground beneath us. We walk down the street, and walking is a physical, animal, sensory experience at the same time as we're thinking. And that's a very big threshold to open. It gives us access not only to a deeper part of ourselves, but also to multiple levels of information about the world, sensing the world. And it's fascinating in the work I do with leaders. We do some very simple but deep work with breathing and grounding. And after 2 or 3 days, people's bodies start to change. It's really, really interesting. You can see it. Because suddenly this comes alive. And then someone will stand in front of the group, and at the beginning they may have stood in front of the group and they were like lead. This had no energy. And suddenly they're standing in front of the group and this is open, and it makes a world of difference. So this work with the earth element is very fundamental. As fundamental, if not more fundamental, is the work with the water element, because here I think we have some of our biggest mistakes in how we currently function. We have, on the whole, a deeply dysfunctional relationship with emotion, particularly in the working world. We either avoid it or we try and fix it. And it's a real process to get to the point of understanding that the only problem with feelings is not feeling them. It's the only problem with feelings. The only problem with fear is the fear of feeling fear. Because the moment, for instance, someone really, really feels fear, first of all, it's a very intense energy. And secondly, whenever we truly feel a feeling, it passes, it moves. This is so simple and so primary, and we've, most of us, myself included, moved very far away from this. So in a team, for instance, it means very simply, if you're having a meeting and you, the leader, recognize that there's actually some emotion present, most times leaders just go on with the topic. Oh, we've got stuff to do. But actually, what must happen in those moments is that he or she, the leader, stops the meeting and simply, feelingly acknowledges the emotional energy that's present. Just acknowledges it, allows people to feel it. That's all that's needed. The last thing that's needed is to explain it or fix it, which is what we do a lot of the time. We rationalize emotion and we try and fix emotion. We rarely create the space with each other simply to allow emotion. And we pay a big, big price for that, because if someone comes to you as a leader and they're in an emotional state, and you just try and fix them and give them a solution, you can guarantee they will walk away from that meeting feeling alienated. And the simple capacity in leadership, the simple yet difficult capacity to simply listen, to be present with emotion, is a huge thing. And if we don't do that, our whole system remains closed, because unfelt emotion is one of the biggest reasons our whole consciousness remains in a narrow bandwidth. And we can externalize it in all kinds of ways. We can blame other people, we can talk about the world, we can project our own internal emotional reality onto the world. But until we be willing to sit in it ourselves, we're sabotaging our work in the world. And this is a very big step. And in the corporate teams I work with, it's a huge step, and it usually only happens at least on the second day, where people become willing to be more emotional. And it's quite amazing then what changes in the whole group. And if it's a team, it opens a completely new possibility in a team. And I'm not talking about just indiscriminate, dramatic emotion. I'm talking about appropriate emotion. And in a leader, I'm talking about robust vulnerability. This is a very high capacity in a leader. Robust vulnerability. A leader who can show, when appropriate, his or her feelings, but in such a way that people feel it's also contained. And a leader who can hold a space in which a team can express their emotions. And is strong enough and open enough to say, tell me how you're feeling. I just want to hear how you're feeling right now. Earlier in the autumn, I was working in America with a group of CEOs from different organizations. And one of them had a kind of mini light bulb when we were talking about this, because he'd had an incident the previous week in which someone had done something illegal. And he'd had to call the police, and the police had arrived and handcuffed this guy and marched him out of the office in front of the whole staff. And he called a meeting, and he said, I realize now, I called a meeting and I just said, look, I'm really sorry I had to do that. You can't do the illegal stuff, that's what had to happen. Let's get on with our work. And he said, I realize now, everyone was shocked. And all I needed to do was just take 5 minutes to let people say and express their feelings. And we'd have moved forward from that incident in a totally different way. Because actually what people carry forward is that unexpressed feeling. Okay, how are we doing on time? What's my timing? I forgot. I'm supposed to finish at 3:30. Yeah? That's right, okay. I can't see the clock. There it is, okay. Okay, the air element, I'm not going to say a lot now, because obviously in the environments in which I work, this is very, very highly developed, although actually not very disciplined a lot of the time. The one thing I work with here, which I'll just mention briefly, is what we call the inner critic. So the inner critic is that part of us, of everybody, that at certain moments of pressure, which will be different for each of us, start talking to us and undermining us, and kind of saying things like, Stefan was a much better speaker than you, they're going to find you boring and all of that kind of stuff. That's not true, but it's that kind of voice, it's that kind of voice. There's a very common one, so common it's actually been given a name, particularly for leaders, called the imposter syndrome. And it seems that the more senior you get, the more likely you are to have this syndrome, because that's the voice that says, one of these days, they're going to realize. Yeah, they're going to realize that they got the wrong person. You're not really capable of this. And I remember the first time 10 years ago I heard this in the CEO of actually one of the UK's main intelligence organisations. And he told me about this insecurity, and I was completely shocked. And then I started to realize that it was very common. So we work with that, and we do quite important work to help people free themselves from that. This is a beautiful element, the fire element, because the fire element is where we connect to what most deeply matters to us. And we also look at how near or how far we are to that at this time in our lives. And it's a very important inquiry, because we often can see that for all kinds of reasons we've actually in some way moved further away from it than we would wish. And in the working world, there's a very simple way of looking at this, which people seem to find very, very powerful. It's two circles. And here I say fire. So fire is your core values. Fire is what gives you the experience of meaning. Fire is what inspires or lights you up. And fire may be also connected in some way to your dream. And all of these, deep down, are to do with your contribution. Our core fire is to do with our wish to contribute something. And here is our world of work. So a very important question for anyone in a leadership position at any one moment is to look at how much these overlap or not. Because all of us go through phases where the two circles separate. And that's very tough, and if that goes on more than weeks or months, we call that a dark night. It's like a dark night of the soul. We're spending 40, 60, 80 hours a week doing something where we've lost the connection between a deep part of ourselves and what we're doing. And this is a frightening conversation sometimes, but also a very authentic conversation and a very essential conversation. Because in leadership, showing up with your authentic fire, I believe, is a very core part of leadership. Not all the time, not every day, but every so often being able to show up in such a way that people see and feel what you really stand for. It doesn't have to be loud, but it has to be really authentic. And again, it's very powerful because a lot of corporate speak, a lot of corporate presentation is in a very dead zone. It's in a very lifeless zone. There's very little water and there's very little fire. But when leaders begin to dare to connect with this and stand in front of groups and communicate more from this place, it's immensely powerful. They don't need to say very much sometimes, but that's the fire that can light people and warm people. As long as it's interesting, as long as it's earth, fire has to be grounded. Because if you think about people who are very fiery and energized and inspired, but they're not grounded, it's not comfortable to be around them. Yeah? Their fire burns you. It's interesting. But people who have a lot of fire but are very grounded and earthed, their fire warms you. And it helps you connect with your fire. It helps you connect with your core sense of purpose in this world, which of course can evolve throughout your life, but it's an essential part of us. And I think we go through life more like this than in a straight line. There are very few people who their whole life remain intimately connected with their fire. Few people, but they're few and far between. Most of us it's like this, and we look back over our life, our working life, and we see that there were these moments in the middle where we were really inspired, where we really felt passionate about what we were doing, and we knew what our core sense of purpose is in the world. But a lot of the time we also go off. Sometimes we have to go right off. And these moments, sometimes it's a crisis, sometimes it's one conversation, but that suddenly wakes us up again, and we come back to this. We find our way back, and we either reconnect the circles, or we have to take a courageous decision that it's time to move into a different territory. When the circles are disconnected, those are the two possibilities. Is this a test, meaning I have to find how to reconnect the circles, or is it a sign that I need to make a bigger change? And then lastly, this fifth element. And here, in a way, is the most important part of the whole message. Because our consciousness has two fundamental capacities. We can be connected to the foreground of life, to the content of life, of consciousness. We can also be connected to a kind of background. And another way of saying about our fixation with doing is that we become fixated on the foreground. And except in odd moments, we've forgotten what it's like to be simultaneously sitting in the background. And that's why disciplines like mindfulness, meditation, physical disciplines like yoga and the martial arts are so important now, because they open this capacity in our consciousness to be as tuned into the background as the foreground. It's like if we look at this page, most of the time we simply look at the black and the blue. And we forget that an equally important part of this page is the white background. And this has multiple implications, because it is only as we develop the capacity to rest also in the background that the possibility of real innovation opens. Because real innovation, the idea came to me, that can only happen when that deeper space is open. So long as we're in content, so long as we're in our familiar modes, there's no space for a deeper level of innovation to occur. And it's very interesting in a team who work for 2 or 3 days, and at a certain moment of real deep presence work, and of working with all the elements, and starting to really engage all the elements, we can move into a deeper silence, literally. It's very radical when a group of senior executives suddenly become willing to sit in silence. It's a very radical step. But then in that silence, what can start to happen is a very different level of insight, and ideas start to open. That are outside our normal parameters, and then you know that you're in the territory of innovation. So a lot of what we call innovation is generating ideas. That's okay. But that's kind of like moving the furniture around to a different position. What I call innovation is something very different. And for that, we have to know what it means to sit in a deep emptiness, which is the fifth element. That's the element of the quarterback knowing where everyone is. It's a very much higher level of consciousness. And I think this is one of, when I spoke earlier of thresholds, I think if we look purely at the journey of consciousness development, this is the threshold we're on now. Individually and collectively learning to be in the foreground and the background at the same time, because that opens a completely different way of being in life. So shall we do a 5-minute mindfulness exercise? Okay. If I see enough nods, I'll take that as a yes. Not sure. Maybe we'll have some questions first. We'll have some questions. Yeah, please. Anyone have any questions? Ah, still there. Still as a dear friend.
Thank you, Nicholas. Going back to your triangle beginning, I was curious, what is at the top point of the triangle?
What is at the top point?
I know the title is high performance, but is that at the top of the triangle?
No. I think that's just a phrase that tempts people. It tempts people to go there. I think there's something much deeper. What would you say is at the top? Because she needs the mic. How? What? Yeah.
I was hoping you knew. I would imagine that it has to do with the synthesis of being and doing.
Right.
Balancing what you might call the yin and the yang.
Yeah.
So it's the sum total. It's how we, because the movement is upwards, it's how we grow through that experience.
Right.
Of bringing the two together.
Right. Right. I have an answer.
I gave you that.
One thing I haven't said yet, which I think is also fundamental to what you're saying, is that when we work with this and when we work with this, there comes a point also that's really critical, which is that we become very much more comfortable with unknowing. And this is very important because there's a lot of literature now in leadership around this, because this side of us hates unknowing. Yeah? This side of us has like a big control department inside and does not like uncertainty or unknowing. And yet, as things get more and more complex, we can't know the way we used to. And this side of us gets very frustrated with that. But the more we practice in a development, the more we come to a much higher level of unknowing and knowing. And we become more comfortable, like any creative artist knows that the deepest creativity comes from going through pure unknowing. And learning to navigate and tolerate that is very important. Like in a meeting, it's getting chaotic, it's getting confusing, it's getting uncomfortable. Okay, let's really be with this. Let's not try and fix this. Let's actually really be with this chaos, this unknowing. Let's live it. Let's live it. So, the more we go up here, I think there's a higher and higher integration of knowing and unknowing. But actually what I was going to say is that a truer map of this, and maybe something that is up here, is that I think the deepest way we can function actually looks like this. That actually being is the whole ground. is the core, it's the essence. And part of any serious meditation or mindfulness practice, and what I just said about background and foreground, is learning to stabilize ourselves more and more and more constantly in this, so that all of our doing is connected with this. Because the moment our doing is disconnected from this, problems start. Does that make sense?
Okay.
I hadn't totally on, but it's an important perspective, this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. You work with leaders, from what I gather.
With what?
With leaders,
Yeah.
right? However, what you say and what you teach seems fundamental for being a human, for any part of society, with regards to a more functional society as well.
Right.
So what might be a good way to teach the broader audience without having to take expensive courses? What would be a good way to develop citizens in that direction?
You expect me to answer that? It's such a great question. Well, I think there are many initiatives now. I mean, for instance, mindfulness is being taught in schools. I think it's very important. It's being brought into the health sector a lot, because interestingly, it's one of the discoveries about mindfulness is that it's a very effective way of working with pain. And the paradox of it is, and this really confuses the rational mind, the paradox is that you pay attention to your pain instead of fighting it. So, you're asking such an important question. And you're right, it can't be about expensive courses. I'm actually part of a wonderful initiative called Circular Society. If you Google Circular Society, you'll see it's an incredible platform now for all of this kind of work, a part of whose intention is to reach as many people as possible who do not have the finance to pay for expensive courses. For myself, one of the things I regularly do, because I get very well paid in the business world, is I give my services for nothing to organizations that I feel inspired to help.
Okay.
But there's much more to the answer. You're speaking next, aren't you? Good, so you answer it.
Next.
While we were here,
Yeah.
while we're on the top of your triangle, I was wondering why you put high performance and not just performance.
Right.
Well, the performance would be neutral. The high performance appears to me manipulative. And then this diagram that you drew almost seems to confirm my question. Because here, depending on the being, that would be the quality of the doing.
Yes, yes. No, I like what you're saying very much. And if I'm honest, the reason I put this here is that it tempts leaders to want to go here.
In other words, manipulative.
Yes. Shamelessly. I tell you some of the other stuff I do, you'd be shocked. Under the guise of relaxation. No, but I totally accept you questioning that, yeah. But it is, we have to engage the conversation, and leaders want to get to this possibility of high performance, but I agree with you, it's not necessarily the best word.
Okay. Next question.
Yes.
What is your meaning of idea? Like Platon?
I don't understand your question.
Idea.
Idea.
Idea. Yeah, what is it? You spoke about idea. And what is your meaning of
The
idea?
term.
What did I say about idea?
Yes.
No.
No, I'm sorry, I really don't understand your question.
It's a term that comes and is closely related with Plato.
Yeah.
And I think there is a system where you have a different terminology.
Right.
And this gentleman just tries to bring those two terminologies, the one you used and the one that somehow sounds familiar with his idea of Plato's
Right.
concept, to bring them together. And is there a connection?
I don't feel qualified enough in Plato's terminology to answer that. I know a bit, but I'm worried that I would get it wrong with someone who knows much more. So I can't really answer that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why do you make the intuitive and the rational a counterpart? I think the intuitive can be very rational. It's just another kind of rationality, but it's not a counterpart.
Maybe. I think this is a question of terminology.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, what I do know is that they're very different I think they're very different ways of getting information. Because through intuition, once your intuition is open, for instance, you can meet someone and within 1 minute you get a whole lot of information about their life, their past, their everything. That has very little to do with rational function.
But it's not irrational.
I didn't say it was irrational, I said it was intuitive.
Okay.
Rational would mean I look at all the data and I look at all the information and then I make rational deduction from that, which is an amazing capacity. Intuitive is a direct knowing. It's just different. One more question. Yeah.
Question. You spoke mainly, as I understood, about kind of change in consciousness,
Yes.
of a leader. What is your experience with, if a group of leaders or in collectives or in teams, when there, when there's a change, or is there how would look a different consciousness or a different way of working together look like in a collective? Do you have
In a team?
Yeah, in a team or in an
Okay.
organization or.
Yes, yeah, that's a very nice question. So there would be different things. First of all, there would be a much more authentic showing up. People show up, not what they do, they show up with much more of themselves. And therefore they connect with each other much more deeply. Because when the bandwidth opens, we connect much more deeply. When we're emotionally authentic, when we're simply authentic. So that's a big part of it. And then, of course, there's a much stronger energy in the whole team when that happens. And that, to go through that, you have to go through difficulty, you have to go through discomfort. Because when we approach that edge of allowing feelings that we don't normally feel, it's uncomfortable. But once the team goes through that, they're in a very different territory of connection. And that's huge. The other thing is a very different level of insight starts to come in. Very different level of understanding, insight, new ideas, and so on. One of the senior teams I worked with for a year in America, and these were very high-level engineers, so extremely technical people. Halfway through the year, they started beginning every meeting with 5 minutes silence. This was a huge thing for them to do, because then they saw that they had a much higher quality of conversation. But by that time, they were much more emotionally connected with each other. I think that gives you some answer. It's like entering a different game board, which is very exciting. And at some point, the desire to really serve and contribute becomes much stronger than what can we take. Because I believe that the deeper we go into our true self, the more we automatically want to give more. And I'm going to finish actually by reading you something. One of the exercises I do regularly and that I did last week with these leaders at the IMD. And it's very shocking for them when I suggest it at the end of day one. I say to them all, you're going to write a poem overnight. You can imagine some of the reaction. And you're going to write a poem about something that really matters to you. So, you know, we go through all the reaction, but then they go away and then they do it. And the next day we come in, and this was a big group, so they went in small groups and they read their poems. So I didn't hear them, but when they came back together, it was clear something had really happened. They were very touched. The whole atmosphere in the room was different. And then some of them stood in front of the whole group and read their poems, which was very powerful. And one of them sent me his poem afterwards, and I want to read it to you, because I think this is a poem about his awakening. And he called the poem Fire. It goes like this. And if we have this feeling of having achieved something that is beautiful beyond the figures, if our group of people involved in making it happen has generously come together as one team, if what we have served has or will have a positive impact on more people inside and outside the company, if in some way we have been able to transform ourselves as much as we have transformed our environment, if people look at what we did with a sense of gratitude and inspiration, if we have been able to mobilize our power in a responsible and respectful way, then we will understand that our talent and resources were being used with dedication and ambition for something that is more valuable than our individual pride and self-achievement. And my flame will grow, and my fire will be able to burn any obstacle, and anyone needing it will be able to be warmed by it.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's have a brief pause